How is a draft reconcilable with the principles of a genuinely free society? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, a show that brings you all the principled case for the freedom philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again in this Christmas season.
I know it's the holiday time of good cheer and happiness and naughty and niceness. And it's wonderful to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, me too. And before we get started, let me just remind everybody that we've got our annual end of year fundraising drive going on. I hope y'all will give us your positive consideration. Y'all have kept us going for 35 years now, delivering this principled case for liberty, trying to move America in a better, or free, peaceful, prosperous, harmonious direction. And I hope you'll give us a hand for the coming year with as generous a donation as you can, and we'd be very honored and very appreciative for your assistance. All right, Richard. So you sent me an article a few days ago on the draft by a guy, I think his name is Michael Ard,
Mhm.
that who is, from what I can tell, an either former part of the national security establishment or a current part, or he has connections to think tanks or foundations or whatever that are part of the national security establishment and have this mindset of world imperial politics, the the battles that take place between America and its rivals and its adversaries. And he's saying that we need to restore the draft to the military because and his big reason is because we're looking at the real possibility of going to war against China or even Russia, and that a voluntary military just will not cut it in such a war, and we've got to get ready for this war. And getting ready means forcing American men to come in and serve the military. And I'm sitting here thinking all kinds of thoughts, of course. One is this imperial mindset that, for one thing, the chances that China or Russia or any other nation would ever invade the United States are non-existent. They don't have the military capability. They don't have the money. They don't have the supply lines. So what he's obviously thinking about is a war over there, which involves the U.S. And so the question naturally arises, why do you have to force people to fight in a war? If your war is really about defense and you're protecting your nation's freedom, my hunch is that 99% of the people are going to go to war and fight. You don't need to force people to fight for self-defense. You only have to force them to fight when they're fighting for something other than freedom. And a war over there is obviously some kind of imperialist type thing. Is it, oh, well, China is involved in taking over Taiwan or over the South China Sea, and so we have to go to war and we have to force Americans, so far only men. I don't think this guy is calling for drafting women yet, but I know that there are people saying it should be equal. But forcing people to go fight in a war is a pretty strong indication that it's not a good war. I mean, people can pretty much judge for themselves what a good war or not a good war is. At the same time, I just read an article stating that the U.S. is pressuring Ukraine to lower its draft age to between 18 and 25. Apparently, they're only drafting people 25 and above, which is totally different from our system where we draft everybody 18 and above. But their rationale is, well, we want to preserve our youth, our country. But it's the U.S. saying you need to force young men to fight there. Well, the reason they have to force people there, as I wrote in a recent blog, is because they're not fighting for freedom. I mean, that's what the U.S. maintains. Oh, the Russians are attacking them, trying to conquer them and deprive them of their freedom. It was always about NATO, that the U.S. wanted to absorb the Ukraine into NATO, and they got Ukraine officials to go along with that, which enables, of course, the U.S., the Pentagon, to post its military personnel, tanks, weapons, nuclear missiles on Russia's border. They knew what the result of that was going to be. They had promised at the end of the Cold War they would never expand eastward. And so the Ukrainian men are sitting there saying, I want to go die for the right to join NATO? That's quite a bit different from fighting to die for freedom. And so the real question is, why should anybody be forced to go fighting in these wars? Well, it's a strong indication that the war's not worth fighting for. That the draft really, to me, is just slavery. It's forcing people to go and serve the government or serve really the national security establishment, the Pentagon or the CIA, the whole military industrial complex, as President Eisenhower had called it. That I think what we really need in this country is a total reexamination, not just of this concept of the draft, but this whole concept of empire, of having bases all over the world that create the potential for conflict, along with this interventionist foreign policy that also is an inducement to war, because that's one of the root problems facing our country. What do you think?
Well, I think I'll just make a slightly stronger statement than you made. You had said that why would you need a military draft if a country was under real attack, and wouldn't people, if they felt that their freedom was at stake from an aggressor actually invading their country, would they not rise up and willingly defend their own nation? I would even make a stronger statement. If another country invades your country and you don't value your freedom enough to defend it, then you shouldn't be forced to defend through compulsory military service a freedom that you don't value enough to risk your own life for. So in fact, a country that is populated with people who would not even defend themselves against a real aggressor probably don't deserve the freedom that they're not willing to come and to risk their own lives to maintain. So those who don't want to defend their liberty don't deserve their liberty, I suppose. But in the broader sense in which you're talking about, obviously the call for the draft is precisely not because there's a threat of the United States itself being invaded. If a war were to break out between the US and some other country, and whether we had an empire or not, but just hypothetically, if another country were to attack the United States, given the geography of the globe, it would really not be an invasion in the traditional sense. It would be a missile war, and you really don't need millions of foot soldiers in a missile war. You just need to have the technologies to self-defend yourself with an anti-ballistic system or whatever. So that's a ruse to say that, America is under threat. What this is about is what you're saying, is that they need bodies to defend the bastions of the defense lines in other parts of the world, whether it be NATO in Europe, whether it be in East Asia, in South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines. The concern is that there are countries that are competitors for imperial control or domination or influence over other parts of the globe that America has had sway over, either directly or indirectly, since the end of the Second World War. And the American empire defenders don't want to risk losing it to these new competitors on the global scene, especially China. And therefore, they need the bodies. If they're going to come to the defense of Taiwan, what might it not involve U.S. military personnel on the ground in Taiwan, or even if that were to be extended to part of a counter invasion of China itself? If there were to be a war between Russia and the NATO countries, we could easily imagine it escalating to at least a tactical nuclear exchange. But it will also involve boots on the ground. There's the concern of the Baltic republics that if a war broke out between NATO, of which they are members, and Russia, The Russian army would invade the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Don't you need American and other European personnel on the ground there to thwart the attack or to counterattack? So this is basically the idea that we need to have sufficient manpower far and above the number of people who are currently volunteering to serve in the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces to be able to withstand ground wars against these rival empire builders around the world. And therefore, it is a way of having a compulsory military to serve the ends of those who want to protect the ramparts of American imperial control. I will just mention another thing is that this is also trying to get enough bodies on the cheap. You can always get enough people to perform a labor service that you would like to have done for you by offering them a sufficiently high wage to attract them. Everyone has their opportunity costs, right? Bob is offering me $10 an hour. Sam is offering me $15 an hour. All other things held the same. I'd rather be earning $15 an hour than 10. Now, if you need both unskilled and skilled personnel to serve in the U.S. military, whether it be someone with tech knowledge or just a foot soldier who you've trained to shoot a rifle, you can offer these people wages sufficient to attract them from private sector civilian employments. But that costs money. And the US government obviously doesn't want to pay, or those who are advocating return to the draft do not want to pay market wages to attract the personnel that they need out of private sector employments instead. So this is basically a way to get people to work for you at below market wages. And that itself shows that those are not the people who should be in the military because their value is greater to society. And I'm using it in the market sense, not the socialist sense. The value of people in society that is performing other jobs to provide other goods and services that people value more highly than what they could earn in the military. So this is just a way of getting people to work for you at below market wages. So instead of a minimum wage, which sets a wage above what the market thinks you're worth, this is a way of setting a wage below and making you accept that wage below what the market thinks you're worth in an alternative employment. So it's distortive, it is manipulative, and it is a denier of individuals' freedom of choice of how they want to earn a living. And every country, even a country that would be strictly defense oriented in the classic liberal libertarian sense, might decide it needs an army of whatever size, given the presumed viewed as threats. And therefore, you need military personnel. And if you do, whether it be a bigger army, a smaller army, etc., you pay the wages necessary to attract personnel, to allow them the freedom of choice, and then not to draw them away from employments where the consumer income taxpayers think they're more valuable given the things that they would like to have.
Well, part of the problem, though, is that they've got out of control debt that they've incurred over the decades with $37 trillion in debt now. And they've got a debasement of the currency that's still taking place. People don't like to pay higher taxes. And so I'm sure they're looking at this saying, well, we can't really afford to pay market wages for this. So
Exactly.
we better conscript these guys and just pay them this low wage, like it or not. But Richard, there's really something much more fundamental here. You know what? My favorite quote ever since I discovered libertarianism is by Johann Goethe. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And I think it really explains the plight of the American people. I think if you did a survey of Americans, 98% at least would say, yeah, we live lives of freedom here in America. We are free individuals. We thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. And that's part of the big problem. Because if you look at a society that's based on the draft or the power to draft, I mean, even if they're not exercising the power, the fact that they wield the power to draft people, I mean, that's what draft registration is. You have to go and register to put your name in the hopper there to be conscripted. It's really no different from being drafted itself in terms of freedom. That in any free society, you have to determine who is the master and who is the slave.
Uh-huh.
And in a draft society, it's government who's the master. It's the government that's saying, if we need you, you will serve us. We will conscript you. We will force you to leave your family, leave your job, and you will go where we tell you to go, and you will give your life for this cause. Well, they're the masters. And as long as you live in that kind of society, and let's keep in mind that Russia's got a draft, North Korea's, well, everybody in North Korea is drafted essentially because everybody has to work for the government. China's got a draft. That in a genuinely free society, government does not wield this authority, that it cannot draft anybody because the citizen is the master and the government is the servant that serves the citizenry. But once they inverted this, and they inverted it during the Civil War, but then it disappears. But then World War One was where it really came into play, the starkness of who's the master and who's the servant, because this was just a standard foreign war, interventionist war. The U.S. government had no role in that war. And the American people understood that, which was why they had to draft them. They had to force them to serve. And at that point, there is no question as to who's the master and who's the servant. If we're going to really establish a genuinely free society, we really need like a constitutional amendment that bars the government from ever conscripting anybody for anything.
Well, that obviously would be an extension of an understanding of a right to life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. Uh, if the purpose of government is to secure liberty as opposed to violate liberty, then the most fundamental liberty and property that one owns is one to one's own person, one mind, and one body. And for the government to conscript your body to serve purposes not of your own consent, and the most extreme being to go and kill and be threatened to be killed, uh, that is an inherently thing inconsistent with both the Declaration of Independence, which is the philosophical document which is behind the US Constitution. So obviously that's the case. But you've referred to the Goethe quote more than once. And I believe that that sort of indicates also the reason why governments consider it so important, if not to directly control, to attempt to highly influence media in society. Uh, what will people think freedom means? What will they view as the opposite of freedom? And that has certainly been the purpose of government compulsory public education. You hold the young minds of the population captive, if you will, from kindergarten through high school, with a mandated curriculum of which history and civics and political science are components in most schools at some point through that period. And you basically give what those in power at that time, the existing institutional ideology, what they want to be the views of the next generation about themselves and their relationships with others and the political and social institutions in which they will be living their lives. Uh, and that way, history is written in mostly about how every president has been a good president. He may have had flaws. He might have done things that now we think is incorrect. But the point is, every president represents the nation. The laws that Congress passed have all been progressive and good. The welfare state was essential because of the hardships during the Great Depression. Government has to manage the economy to assure full employment because of what went on during those Great Depression years of the early 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt had to save capitalism from its own wanton, unregulated self. America has to be the beacon of freedom around the world. Yes, World War I was a disappointment, and there was this terrible reaction of not wanting to be involved, but we realized we couldn't escape our role on the international scene with the necessity of America's participation in World War II to free the world from tyranny. And then another tyranny arose, communism, in the materialized form of Soviet Russia under Stalin, and then Mao in China. We've had to be at the ramparts to protect the world. So yes, does the country make mistakes? Do the political authorities act irresponsibly or even sometimes illegally. But beneath all of those particulars, there's the general guiding principle of America must have its place in the world to not only protect its own freedom, but the freedom of all of the countries without whom we are not secure ourselves in the long run. That's the ideology for which the media and education needs to be manipulated, influenced, and ultimately, like with the school curriculum, controlled. Because that is the way that you make people believe this is the meaning of freedom, this is unfreedom. And what you have is freedom, and what we're opposing is unfreedom, and you shouldn't confuse. And if someone tells you that you're not free at home, well, they haven't understood the real experiences of history that we've learned from, that says we have to have a regulated economy. We have to have a redistributed welfare state. We need to have an economy in which the government has to directly control certain things, put its hand in government business partnerships for the good of the society. So that when a classical liberal or libertarian gets into a conversation with someone and makes these kind of cases, either on domestic or foreign policy issues, the person's first reaction is, what are you talking about? Government has to do these things. And why do they take this as for granted? Because that is what the educational system and the government influence media system has basically made people believe is the reality in which they live.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the root of this mindset that we live in a free society starts in the first grade. I mean, where you stand up to pledge allegiance and in a country with liberty and justice for all. And that indoctrination goes on for 12 long years. And then it continues really in a lot of state-supported colleges and universities. So by the time people become adults, they are convinced they live in a free society. And so they look at us libertarians like, God, how strange are you all? What are you libertarians fighting for? We're fighting for a free society. What? Oh, that's really weird. We already live in a free society. And but it's not just that they indoctrinate you on specific items like, we need the welfare state to take care of people because without it, people would be dying in the streets of starvation. It's the general mindset of deference to authority, that whatever they say, the mind orients toward it and says, yes, we've got to support the government in this sense, and especially the national security state. Now, you know that I've written a lot about why we need to dismantle the whole national security state. I think it's the worst mistake America ever made, much worse than even the welfare state conversion, that we need to restore a limited government republic. Wasn't a perfect system, but it worked very well for over 150 years. And part of this indoctrination you're talking about is that you just come to accept the notion that the government comes up with its list of official enemies or rivals or opponents. And you take China, for example. I mean, there was a time when you and I were growing up as kids that China was an extremely poor country. I mean, it had a total socialist system, the massive poverty. Then I don't know when it was in the 80s or 90s where they start to liberalize their economy, moving in a quote libertarian free market direction. They didn't dismantle their political system. Their political system was still communist, but people started getting wealthy in China. Standards of living were rising. It seems to me that this is something that we should celebrate. The fact that people in other parts of the world are raising their standard of living. Isn't this great? That there's not people starving to death like they are in North Korea or something. Even though they're a communist system, I remember there was a time where there were libertarian think tanks going to China and having conferences, and this was a time of great celebration. But it seems that as soon as a nation like that starts rising in terms of standard of living, the state is obviously getting stronger because its tax revenues are increasing. There comes the threat. Oh my gosh, China is now a threat. It's a rival. It's an opponent. Really? Why? Why can't we just celebrate the fact that people around the world are getting wealthier, higher standards of living? We're benefiting from the free trade that takes place between these two nations instead of seeing this in a collectivist sense of, oh my gosh, our empire is now threatened. We need to start drafting people. We need to start getting ready for war. And one of the best examples of this different kind of mindset which is why I love it so much, is that peace speech that John Kennedy gave in June of '63, where he achieved a breakthrough, where all of a sudden the Soviet Union was not seen as this monumental threat that we needed to face and confront and get really close to nuclear war with. He said, look, in that peace speech, okay, we have different ideologies. That doesn't mean we have to have this permanent hostility toward each other. We can cooperate, we can compete, but we don't have to have this permanent aura of mindset of hostility toward each other. And I think that's one of the big horrible things of this indoctrination, is this notion that we're surrounded by opponents, rivals, enemies, instead of nations that are ready to cooperate with us, especially in the areas of trade.
Yeah, obviously there is a reason why classical liberals since the 19th century have insisted that the benefits of freedom of trade is it creates a network of mutual cooperation, but also mutual interdependency. You're my customer, you're my supplier, you're also, and I'm the same for you. So if we are intertwined, and well, let me give an example that I've often used with my students. Imagine that it's 10 years, 20 years into the future, and some great crisis has arisen between the United States and China. And the sabers are being rattled. There's a concern about a nuclear confrontation as well as ground battles between the two sides. And there's a knock on the door of some prominent leader in China, in Beijing, and it maybe even the head of the government, and he says, "Come in," and who comes in? His son, and his son says, "Pop, what do you mean you're about to start a nuclear war with the United States? Don't you know that I'm heavily invested in some companies in Silicon Valley? Don't you know that I have a nice, multi-million-dollar condo at the top of the mark in San Francisco, and your own daughter-in-law and grandkids are there on a holiday, and you're about to nuke them?" See, the whole point of that is that your own interest makes you want to think twice because of the costs of going to war. When you are there as an investor, as someone who's dependent as a consumer on what others are providing to you, your supply chains, your own economic and standard of living well-beings are intertwined. Now, does that guarantee that wars never break out? Of course not. But it creates networks of benefits and costs that make you have to think twice in your roles as political leaders before you bring about a conflagration that results in the destruction economically and even every other way if you get into a major war with another country. So trade binds peoples together, politics divides them. And the more that we can leave things to the private arena of trade, exchange, investment, and movement, the better it is for all of us.
Yeah, I really like that the interdependencies of trade diminish the incentive for war. I would add to that also families, that intermarriages between nations and people migrating over to the United States and still have family over in another part of the world. They're not interested in bombing their families. There's less incentive for that. And I know we're about out of time, but I really like, as you know, to kind of paint the picture of what the ideal is here. And for me, the ideal is the United States dismantles its empire. No more foreign interventionism. Monstrous things will happen around the world. There's no question. But as John Quincy Adams said, the American government will not go abroad to slay those monsters. Those will happen. But we have a limited government republic here with just a basic military force, just like we had when the nation got founded, and it lasted for 150 years. We don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We have free trade. We have open borders, free movements of people back and forth. And then we have a very strong nation. That's what people don't realize. They think that the stronger the government, the stronger the nation. It's the exact opposite. You're weaker your government, you're stronger your nation. because now you've got rising standards of living, massive accumulation of capital, so that if you did get in a war, you could convert those things over into military uses. When you have a massive government, you're impoverishing that society. You're making that society weaker rather than stronger. So that's the ideal, is a free market society here at home, people accumulating unlimited amounts of wealth, deciding for themselves what to do with it, voluntary charity, no foreign interventionism, no empire, and watch America lead the world toward the highest reaches of freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony that mankind has ever seen.
I couldn't say it better.
Well, thank you, Richard. All right, on that note, we'll wrap
next time.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. And if you like what we do here at FFF, and I certainly hope you do, including this show, I hope you'll consider us in your generous end of year giving. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.